She was 22, and she had been turned out of the only house she had ever called home, with a canvas satchel on her shoulder and the cold of a Vermont November pressing against the back of her neck. No bed, no kin who would still answer the door, just a brass school bell wrapped in a square of flannel, and 9 wrinkled dollars she had earned washing dishes at the diner on Route 14. And with that $9, she bought a forgotten one-room schoolhouse on the old Stagecoach Road in Caledonia County, Vermont, in a stretch of hill country that had not heard a teacher's voice or a child's recitation since 1962. The roof sagged at the ridge like the spine of a tired horse, and the front step had rotted clean through. And a paper wasp's nest the size of a lantern hung from the eaves above the door. But what nobody knew was that hidden beneath the warped pine floorboards of that schoolhouse was something that would change her life forever. If you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. Her name was Hannah Wexler, and she had grown up with the smell of chalk dust on her grandmother's sleeves, and of wood smoke clinging to wool, and of cold maple syrup pouring over biscuit at 5 in the morning, and of the iron handle of the school bell warming under a small hand on a winter day. She had grown up with the sound of slate pencils scraping, and of boots stamped clean on a horsehair mat, and of her grandmother's voice reading aloud from a brown book of poems that had once belonged to someone older. She had grown up with the feel of cold pine floorboards through wool stockings, and of the round weight of a globe under her palm as she turned it slowly, looking for places she had only heard of, and of the small ridged spine of a primer pressed against her ribs as she walked the 2 miles home in the dusk. She had grown up watching a woman in a navy wool dress kneel at a child's desk and explain a sum until the child understood it, and then watch that woman quietly close the brown book and rest her hand on the child's shoulder as though she had given a benediction. There were ledgers in the back room, and chalk in a tin, and a globe with the old country names still on it, and a row of small coats on a row of small hooks, even after there were no more children to wear them. There was a kettle on the iron stove that was never cold for long, and a tin of dried mint on the shelf above it, and a folded gray apron hanging on a nail beside the door that smelled, even years later, of pine smoke and a particular kind of soap. Hannah did not yet know that all of it had begun with a woman she had never met, in a year when Vermont was still half wilderness, and the road outside had been only a wagon track, and the hill country had been a place a young widow could be left to live or die without anyone in particular noticing which. The woman's name was Anna Marie Wexler, and she had come up from the docks of New York in the spring of 1841 with a trunk full of primers and a husband who would not live out the year. She was 19 and pregnant and Lutheran and entirely alone by the first frost, and the hill people of Caledonia County did not know what to do with her, except to give her the use of a sheep barn on a piece of land nobody wanted, on the high crooked bend of Stagecoach Road where the wind always blew. She had crossed the Atlantic with a small bone-handled paring knife in her pocket and a brass schoolhouse bell sewn into the lining of her dress, because her mother in Pomerania had told her that a woman who could ring a bell and cut an apple could keep a household alive in any country in the world. She tore down the sheep barn board by board, and she carried each board on her own back to the level place above the spring, and there she set the cornerstone of a one-room schoolhouse with her own hands in the rain of a May afternoon, while her son slept in a basket under an oilcloth on the grass beside her. She put up the walls with pegged white pine cut from the ridge, and she split her own shingles, and she set a black iron stove in the middle of the room, because a child cannot read with frozen fingers. She laid the floorboards last, in a single long afternoon in late August, and she left one short board loose in front of the teacher's table, because her father had been a cabinet maker, and he had taught her that every house should have one place where a thing could be kept that nobody else knew about. She wrote the first lesson on a slate the morning her son turned 4, and she rang a brass bell that had been her mother's in Pomerania, and 7 children walked up the road through the wet grass to learn their letters from a woman who had buried her husband under a fieldstone marked only with the year. For 61 years she rang that bell, every weekday between September and June. In shoes she mended herself, and in dresses she sewed by lamplight. And she taught the children of the hill people, and then the children of those children, and she did not marry again, and she did not leave, and when she died in the winter of 1902, she was buried under that same fieldstone beside her husband, and the schoolhouse passed to her granddaughter, and so on down the women of the family, each one a teacher, each one ringing the same brass bell, until at last it came to Hannah's grandmother, Marta Wexler, in the year 1948. It was Marta who taught Hannah, and Marta who walked her up the stagecoach road on Saturdays from the time the girl could walk, and Marta who set her at the smallest desk in the back of the room and put a slate in her hands and a piece of chalk between her thumb and forefinger and showed her the shape of the letter A. By the time Hannah was 6, she could sit still for the length of a full lesson without fidgeting, and she could fetch a stick of kindling from the woodbox without spilling the others, and she could carry a tin cup of water from the spring without losing a drop. By the time she was 8, she could read the brown book of poems aloud without stumbling, and she knew the names of all 26 countries on the old globe, and she could keep a wood fire alive in the iron stove for a whole afternoon without burning her fingers on the door latch. By the time she was 10, she could write a clean copperplate hand on lined paper, and she could spell the long old Vermont place names, the Menfremagogs and the Passumpsics, and she could read aloud to a small child without sounding as though she were reading. By the time she was 12, she could mend a slate frame with hide glue, and she could restring the sash cords on a hung window, and she could pour out tea for a sick neighbor in such a way that the neighbor did not feel pitied. By the time she was 15, she had read aloud at the funerals of 3 old men of the parish, in the slow, careful voice her grandmother had given her, and she had taught a boy of 6 his letters in a single winter while his mother lay sick across the valley. By the time she was 18, she could keep the ledgers of a small school in a clean hand, and she could measure a child's progress without praising too soon, and she could sit in a silence long enough for a frightened student to find his own answer. And in all those years, she did not once hear Marta raise her voice, and she did not once see Marta turn a child away from the door of the schoolhouse, no matter how late, no matter how poor, no matter how unwashed, no matter how the child smelled of wood smoke, or of cow barn, or of something sadder that did not have a name. Marta taught Hannah 3 rules at the threshold of the schoolhouse, and she made the girl repeat them aloud every Saturday morning before they crossed inside, in the cold of the porch, with the brass bell ringing once above their heads. The first rule was this: a teacher kneels. You do not stand above a child who is trying to understand, you kneel beside him. Because the truth does not come down from a height, it rises up out of the ground between 2 people who are looking at the same thing. A child cannot find an answer while a tall shadow is falling across his slate, Marta said, and a child cannot speak while a tall voice is pressing down on the top of his head. You kneel because the knee is the oldest place of teaching, older than the chair, older than the lectern, older than the schoolhouse itself. The second rule was this: a teacher waits. You do not finish the sentence the child has begun, and you do not put the answer in his mouth before he has reached for it, because the moment of finding is the only thing a teacher truly gives, and it cannot be given if it has already been taken. The silence between a question and an answer is not empty, Marta said. It is the room in which the child becomes a person who knows a thing. If you fill that room with your own voice, you have built a house the child cannot live in. And the third rule was this: a teacher keeps the fire. You do not let the stove go cold, you do not let the lamp go out. You do not let the bell go silent, because as long as the fire is kept and the bell is rung, a child who has nowhere else to go will know that there is a place on the road where a woman will be waiting for him at the door. The fire is not for warmth alone, Marta said. The fire is the sign. The fire is the answer to the question the child has not yet learned how to ask. Marta died on a Tuesday in October in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse on Buffalo Brook Road, with Hannah at the bedside and a brown book of poems open on the quilt. She had been ringing the bell for 60 years that autumn, and she had taught the last 3 generations of children on the Stagecoach Road, and on the morning she died she sent Hannah out to ring the bell one more time at the schoolhouse, and Hannah walked the 2 miles in the dark and rang it, slow and full, 8 times across the hollow, and walked back, and Marta was gone before the kettle had finished boiling. The farmhouse was lost to a cousin's debt within the year, sold at auction on the courthouse steps in a cold spring rain to pay a note Hannah had never seen and could not contest. The schoolhouse, deeded to no living person, fell into the hands of the county, and the county boarded it shut with sheets of plywood and a single padlock and a notice nailed to the door in language nobody on the Stagecoach Road bothered to read. An aunt took Hannah in for a season and then sent her away when a new husband objected to a quiet niece who read at the window and would not laugh at his jokes. Hannah slept in the back room of the diner on Route 14 in exchange for washing dishes, and she folded her grandmother's flannel around the brass bell and kept it under her cot. And she did not cry, because Marta had taught her that the bell rings best in a steady hand, and a steady hand does not come from a heart that has spent itself on what cannot be brought back. She washed dishes by night and walked the shoulders of Route 14 by day, and she did not speak more than was needed, and the diner cook, a tired man named Lou, who had known Marta in his boyhood, gave her an extra biscuit each morning and did not ask her any questions she could not answer. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small one-room place in your family where someone taught you something patiently, that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here? It means more than you know. It was on a Thursday in early November, with the maples already bare and the first thin skin of ice on the puddles along Route 14, that Hannah walked the 3 miles to the county courthouse in Danville to ask after a parcel she had heard mentioned in passing, a schoolhouse on Stagecoach Road that the county wanted off its books. She wore her grandmother's wool coat, and she carried the flannel-wrapped bell under her arm, and she had 9 wrinkled dollars folded inside the pocket of her dress. She climbed the granite steps slow, and she opened the heavy oak door, and inside the smell was of varnish and cold paper, and her boots sounded too loud on the marble floor. The clerk at the property window was a man named Edwin Pell, and when she said the address aloud, he set down his pen and looked at her properly for the first time. "Wexler," he said quietly. "You would be Marta's girl." Hannah said yes. He went very still, and he said that the key had been kept in the storeroom in an envelope marked with her grandmother's name since 1962, waiting for a Wexler woman to come for it. He came back with a long iron key worm from his hand and laid it on the counter beside the deed. Hannah set down the $9, and Edwin Pell stamped the paper, and he said, soft, that the place had been waiting a long time for someone to come and unlock the door. The walk to the schoolhouse took her the better part of the afternoon, north on Stagecoach Road past the covered bridge at Joe's Brook and up the long crooked grade where the wind always blew. With the iron key in her right hand and the flannel-wrapped bell tucked inside her coat against her ribs. She passed the stone wall where Marta had once shown her the nest of a winter wren, and the bend where the road dipped through the hemlocks and the air turned a degree colder, and the rusted mailbox of a farm that had gone out of milk 20 years before. The October light was already failing by the time she came around the last bend and saw the building set back from the road on its level place above the spring, the white pine boards weathered to silver. The small belfry tipped sideways like a man's hat in a wind, the windows boarded with plywood gone soft at the corners, the wasp's nest hanging gray and intricate from the eaves above the door. She stood at the foot of the path for a long while without moving, and the wind came down off the ridge and lifted the hem of her coat, and a single crow called once from the maples behind the building. And then she went up the path, and she stepped over the rotted front step, and she fit the iron key into the door, and she turned it, and the lock gave with a small dry click that sounded like a word she had not heard in years. Inside it was dim and cold and smelled of dust and mouse and old paper, and underneath those smells, very faintly, of the soap Marta had used to wash the chalkboard at the close of every term. The desks were still there, 16 of them in 4 neat rows, with the slates tilted against the wells. The brown book of poems was on the teacher's table, where Marta had left it on a June afternoon in 1962. The globe was on its stand, with the old country names still on it. The iron stove was in the middle of the room, and the row of hooks on the back wall still had a single small wool coat hanging from one of them, gone gray with the years, the size of a coat that would have fit a boy of about 6. Hannah set the flannel-wrapped bell on the teacher's table, and she opened the flannel, and she set the brass bell upright beside the book of poems, and she stood in the middle of the aisle and listened to the schoolhouse breathe. The wind moved once across the belfry above her, and a single board in the back wall creaked the way an old man creaks when he turns over in a chair, and then the room was still again, as though it had taken a long breath and was waiting to see whether she would take one too. It was when she crossed toward the stove to see if the chimney was clear that her boot pressed down on a floorboard in front of the teacher's table, and the board gave under her weight with a sound that was not the sound of a sound floor. She knelt. She set her hand on the board. It rocked. She remembered then, with a small, sharp clarity, that Marta had stepped over this same place every morning of every Saturday of Hannah's childhood, never quite on the board, always around it, the way a horse will step around a stone in a familiar field. She worked the edge up with the iron key, and then with her fingers, and the board came free, and the board beside it came free, and a square of dark opened beneath the teacher's table, the size of a hearth. She found the lantern on the windowsill where Marta had always kept one, and she found a tin of matches in the drawer of the teacher's table, and she lit the wick and lowered the lantern down into the dark. There was a cedar chest below the floor, set careful on 4 flat stones, the lid bound with 2 iron straps gone the color of dried blood. The chest was not locked. The lid lifted with a small sigh of old wood, the kind of sigh a thing makes when it has been holding its breath for a long time. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a stack of leather-bound books, 8 of them, each one a ledger, in a careful slanted hand, the first dated 1841, the last dated 1902, every child taught in the schoolhouse, named by name with the years of his attendance, and the lessons he had mastered and the things he had grown up to do. Hannah lifted the top ledger and turned a page at random and saw, written in a young hand, the name of a boy who had become a country doctor, and beside it, in a steadier later hand, the date of his death in 1889 and a single line, he set my mother's arm in the winter of 1873 and would not take payment. She closed the ledger gently and set it on the floor beside her knee. Beneath the ledgers, wrapped in a square of linen yellow with age, was a roll of 41 gold coins, half-eagle pieces dated between 1838 and 1859, each one struck soft by time, the edges worn smooth by long lying together in the dark. Beneath the coins, in a small mahogany box lined with faded blue velvet, lay a primer with a green cover and the name Anna Marie Wexler written inside the front board in a girl's hand. and a brass schoolhouse key identical to the one Hannah held, and a slate pencil worn to the length of a thumb. And beneath the mahogany box, folded once and sealed with a wafer of red wax pressed with the letter W, was a single sheet of heavy paper addressed in a flowing brown ink to whoever finds this. Hannah sat down on the floor of the schoolhouse beside the open hole with the lantern at her knee, and she broke the wax seal, and she unfolded the paper, and she read it aloud in the slow, careful voice her grandmother had given her, because some words are meant to be spoken, not only seen. To whoever finds this, the letter began. My name is Anna Marie Wexler, and I am writing this on the 14th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1859, in the 18th year of teaching in this schoolhouse on the Stagecoach Road, which I built with my own hands in the spring after my husband died. I do not know who will read this letter. I hope it will be a woman of my own blood, but if not, I hope it will be a teacher, because only a teacher will know what to do with what is buried here. The coins were sent to me from Pomerania by my mother's brother across 19 years, 3 at a time, in letters I have burned, against the day a Wexler woman might need them to keep the schoolhouse open when the county would not. I have never spent one. I have made my living by mending and by teaching and by what the hill people brought me in baskets at the end of the harvest, and I have eaten plain food, and I have walked everywhere I have ever needed to go, and the coins have lain here under this floor for the children who will come after me. The ledgers are the names of every child I have taught, and every child my daughter will teach after me, and the children after them, and they are the only record that any of these children were ever here. The primer was mine when I was a girl in the old country, and the key is the first key I cut for this door, and the pencil is the one I wrote the first lesson with. If you have come to this place, then a fire has gone out somewhere on this road, and another must be lit. Kneel beside the child. Wait for the child. Keep the fire and ring the bell, and the children will come up the road through the wet grass as they came to me. I have been waiting a long time for you. I am very glad you are here. Anna Marie Wexler, teacher, Stagecoach Road, Caledonia County, Vermont, in the year of our Lord 1859. Hannah folded the letter back along its old crease and set it on the floor beside her knee, and she did not cry, because Marta had taught her that some moments are too large for crying, and the only thing to do is to put a hand flat on the floor and feel that the floor is still there. She sat that way for a long time, with the lantern burning steady at her knee, and the cedar chest open beside her, and the 8 ledgers stacked on the boards, and outside the schoolhouse the wind moved once across the belfry, and was still, and somewhere down by the spring a small night creature stirred in the leaves, and was quiet again. And the lantern light caught the gold of the coins through the linen, and laid a thin warm line across the back of her hand. In the morning she walked back into Danville with one of the half-eagles in her pocket, and she carried it to a coin dealer named Howard Quint on Hill Street, who set his loop to it and went quiet for a long while, and asked her, "Careful, if there were others." She said there were 40 more. Howard Quint valued the roll of 41 half-eagles at $31,400, and he said that 2 of the dates were rare enough that a museum in Montpellier would likely pay more for those alone. And he said it in the soft voice a man uses when he is afraid the news might knock a young person off her feet. The ledgers, he said, were not his line of work, but a woman he knew at the Historical Society would weep to see them, and would not let them out of the county for any price. Hannah did not sell the coins that week. She did not sell them that month. She walked back up the Stagecoach Road in the gray rain of a November afternoon, and she cleaned the iron stove with a wire brush, and she split a small armload of pine kindling from a deadfall behind the building, and she laid a fire and she lit it, and the chimney drew clean on the first try, the way Marta had said it always would if the schoolhouse was kept right. She mended the front step with 2 planks from a fallen barn down the road, and she scraped the wasp's nest down with a long stick. And she pulled the plywood from the windows, and she washed each pane with vinegar water until the November light came through clean and lay in long pale bars across the pine floor. She set the cedar chest back into its hollow under the boards and fitted the floorboards down over it the way Anna Marie had fitted them in the August of 1841. And she nailed a small leather tag inside the drawer of the teacher's table with the date she had opened the chest, because she had decided, sitting there in the lantern light, that the chest would be opened once in each teacher's lifetime and no more, and that the next Wexler woman would find it the way she had found it, with the wax still red and the linen still yellow and the letter still folded along its old crease. She rang the brass bell on a Tuesday morning, slow and full, 8 times across the hollow, the way Marta had rung it. Within the week, an old man named Carl Spaulding came up the road with a tin of stove polish and a story about how Marta had taught him long division in 1959. And he stood in the doorway with his cap in his hand and would not come inside until Hannah said his name aloud and asked him to. Within the month, a woman named Ruth Devereaux came up with a quilt for the cot in the back room and a memory of Marta kneeling beside her at a desk in 1953, and she set the quilt on the cot and smoothed it flat with both hands and said only, "This is where it belongs." That is the thing about the teaching our grandmothers give us. It does not pass through a will, and it does not pass through a deed, and it does not pass through any office of the county. It passes through a brass bell wrapped in flannel, and a brown book of poems, and a kneeling, and a waiting, and a fire kept burning in an iron stove on a hill above a spring. It passes through a loose floorboard left on purpose by a woman in 1841 and stepped around on purpose by a woman in 1962 and lifted at last by a woman in November of a year nobody had yet thought to write down. Kneel beside the child. Wait for the child. Keep the fire. The road will bring them. Hannah Wexler was 22 years old, and she had been turned out with nothing but a canvas satchel and a brass bell wrapped in flannel. She had $9 to her name, and she spent it on a rotting schoolhouse on the old Stagecoach Road in Caledonia County, Vermont. It was the best $9 she ever spent. Thank you for sitting with us tonight. See you in the last warm light of the day.